So year 11s, we're now looking at interactions in communities, and we're going to specifically be looking at competition, predation, symbiosis. Then we'll move on into the different ways that these organisms share energy. So we're looking at nutrition and trophism, or trophic pyramids. But first of all, the specific interactions. So when organisms require the same resource, we call that competition. And competition drives adaptation, and therefore eventually evolution. And we can have many interesting examples of this. Typically, competition actually drives adaptation in a way to reduce competition. So if we use as a very simple example, giraffes versus elephants, a giraffe has developed long legs and a long neck so that it can reach the tops of trees rather than having to compete for the grassland with the elephant. The elephant has adapted an incredibly long trunk so that it can sweep up large amounts of grass or large amounts of shrub and put those into its mouth. These are some examples of adaptations to develop or to work around competition, specifically to reduce the competition experience. When an interaction results in the consumption of one population by another, we call this predation. Now, this also drives adaptations. We can kind of consider it basically like an arms race, where one organism is constantly trying to outdo the other to avoid being eaten or to eat. And we can, again, think of an example, cheetahs versus gazelles or antelope. The antelope has incredible endurance, so it will typically be able to run for longer than the cheetah. So what the cheetah does then is it develops the adaptation to run incredibly fast. It has explosive speed rather than endurance. It doesn't seek to outdo the antelope for endurance. It seeks to outdo it for speed. Now, both of these drive communities or shape communities, change communities. And we can see that, how we've developed these changes. When we're looking now at symbiosis, we can see even more this example. Symbiotic relationships, interactions that occur between two different species. Now, symbiosis can be classified as either mutualism, commensalism, or parasitism, and this depends on the impact the relationship has on both parties. And again, this interaction has an important role in developing the community by selecting for specific adaptations in the populations involved. And again, we'll talk about those examples in a moment. So we're looking at mutualism. This occurs when both species benefit from the relationship. And the best example that we can come up with, or the simplest example, is cows with bacteria. Cows have a specialized stomach, so they've adapted to have this specialized stomach called the rumen. And this contains bacteria to help digest cellulose in their food. These bacteria have adapted to survive in the stomach, not a place where bacteria are normally able to survive. Commensalism happens when one benefits but the other isn't harmed. Barnacles living on larger organisms is a great example of this. A barnacle attached to a whale does no harm to the whale, but it is able to move around with the whale and get a new source of food. Parasitism, on the other hand, is where one organism benefits and the other organism is harmed. Now, this is any kind of bacterial infection is the greatest example of that. This is where it causes disease. This is a brilliant example of this kind of relationship. And again, there's an adaptation involved. The bacteria is specifically adapted to take advantage of a weakness in our immune system, whether it's a cut or a reduced immune system because of lack of sleep or a poor diet or whatever it is. They are specifically designed and adapted to make the best use of that advantage. Now where we're looking at nutrition and trophism, all organisms will need some source of food. However, the way that they satisfy that need differs, and it differs quite remarkably. Autotrophs, they are organisms that are able to make their own food from inorganic molecules. Now, an inorganic molecule is any molecule that doesn't contain both carbon and hydrogen. So autotrophs are able to take these molecules from their environment and convert it into organic molecules. And we're most interested in carbon. We're most interested in autotrophs' ability to convert carbon dioxide into glucose. So we say that these organisms are the producers in a community because they make everything else that's required for the community. Heterotrophs are the other extreme. They aren't able to make any organic molecules from inorganic molecules, or very, very few. So instead, they take the organic molecules from other organisms, whether it's plants or whether it's other animals, and they use those for their own bodies. And then lastly, we come to saprotrophs, our decomposers. Decomposers, saprotrophs, take energy from the dead organic tissue of other organisms. So they take the organic molecules and they recycle it back into inorganic molecules. And here we can see our cycle. Autotrophs, inorganic to organic. Heterotrophs, organic to organic. And saprotrophs, organic to inorganic, to go back to the autotroph. So it's a really critical, really important cycle. Where we're looking now, categorizing things once again. In any community, there is a pattern of feeding relationships, a pattern of predator versus prey. And this develops over time. And certain organisms will consistently occupy a particular level within this pattern. The levels are called trophic levels because it relates to food, and this is what trophism is. And they're numbered according to how far removed a predator is from the producer of the food web or food chain. Producers are always the first trophic level. And then we go to secondary consumers, or the second trophic level, and the third trophic level, and the fourth trophic level. In food webs, consumers can sit in several trophic levels, and so the description of trophic levels is a bit imperfect. But it's still useful because it indicates the energy flow in the community. In food chains, on the other hand, it's a very linear description, and it gives us a very clear indication of where something sits, but it's not complete. And I'll illustrate that in our example that we're going to put up on the board in just a moment. So here we have our generalized example of a trophic pyramid. We have our producers down the bottom all the way up to our last consumer. Now most trophic levels or most trophic pyramids don't go past the quaternary because there's so much energy lost. Let's use our specific example that we've got here. So we start with our plants. I'll do this in black over here. So here we have our particular trophic levels. Plants down the bottom, vole, weasel, owl. Now, this is only true when the owl eats the weasel. But owls are also very capable of eating the vole, the little mouse-like creature. So an owl in this food web could be acting as a tertiary consumer or a secondary consumer, depending on which organism it eats.